Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and our lectures on the Harvard Classics. We now turn in our Harvard Classics volume number 4 to lecture number 29, Paradise Regained, Book 1. Now, it's significantly important, I hope, that you have been with me for prior conversations. If not, significant that you would go to learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find the link there that is associated with the Harvard Classics, and for sure study my lecture that came right before this one, number 28, An Introduction to Paradise Regained. But I would also recommend that it would make sense that you have a sense of the history of some of the comments we've been making by go back and looking at some of our Paradise Lost lectures. Theoretically, it would be ideal if you've studied those lectures with me so that you're able to come to this series of comments on Paradise Regained, an epic not of 12 books like Paradise Lost, but rather 4 books. Now, there's always been a lot of debate in Milton scholarship about where to put Paradise Regained as an important text. For example, when Mortimer Adler and his group put together the Great Book series, which follows obviously after the Harvard Classics several decades later, they elected to not include Paradise Regained in their volume of Milton. They gave other texts of Milton, but not Paradise Regained. So there are some scholars who feel like this one doesn't deserve to be considered as one of his great works. I'm going to make the argument that I think that it deserves every bit, if not almost as much, as the greatness of Paradise Lost. There's no question that there is no poem like Paradise Lost. I think I said that in earlier lectures. But I really do feel like, and I'll try and make this argument with you as I said in my intro lecture comments, that I think that this is a text that really is worth our time and consideration. And often, of course, when you purchase volumes today of Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained will be there as well. I find it unfortunate that Paradise Regained is oftentimes not assigned on reading lists in university and high school programs, but Paradise Lost is. I feel almost like it's kind of like what we've said about Dante in our study of Divine Comedy. You can read Inferno, but if you don't read the other 2 sections of Divine Comedy, you're missing out, and I feel the same is true of Paradise Regained. Now, just to remind, we're working with our 3 levels of reading. What does the text say, level 1? What does the text mean, level 2? Here we divide up into themes, messages, 2A, rhetoric, 2B. And then finally, how do I relate this text to other texts that I know, 3A, and the world, and also 3B, how do I relate to myself? We also are working with our 3 perspectives on Paradise Regained in the same way that we were looking at Paradise Lost. A text that is no question an epic. We're going to see the Invocation of the Muse right away. A text that's philosophic and theological, not just the question of theodicy, but the question of free will. And we'll see some other kinds of philosophic questions that will be addressed, interestingly addressed in Paradise Regained, that are not addressed in the same way in Paradise Lost. Maybe this is because Milton is maturing at the end of his life and he's coming to terms with the fact that this is maybe the last thing that he will produce of greatness. We'll talk about Samson Agonistes, the other last text of Milton, in a later series of lectures. And then finally, the political text, the political Milton, no question, is the psychological and sociological kinds of observations. We'll want to make those as well here when we study. Now, just to point out, because in prior lectures of Paradise Lost, we always turn to that argument that was created by Milton in the second publishing of that poem. We don't have any of that in Paradise Regained, but rather we just get right into the invocation of the Muse, as we've referred to it in earlier lectures. Milton wanting to be in that classical tradition of especially Homer and Virgil, and we're going to see a lot of tipping of the hat to Homer and Virgil in Paradise Regained. Now, I said this in my earlier lectures, and I'll say it now. Although those of you who have been following me in these lectures, you know that I'm reading a lot of Milton, the truth of the matter is not enough. I really believe this. I wish I could read every line and exegete with you as we went. I just don't have the time to be able to do that. So we'll only be looking at certain parts of Paradise Regained Book 1 in our lecture here. But let's at least begin with our invocation, those first 17 lines. And let's see everything that's going on in these opening lines. It's interesting, he begins with the word I, who, while the happy garden sung, of course here, we're already tipping our hat towards Virgil. In the ancient Renaissance editions of Virgil's Aeneid, they had actually this, "I am he who once tuned my song on a slender reed," that is to say, referencing for Virgil the Gorgeous before the Aeneid. We're having the same game played here. Of course, that happy garden will be that paradise lost Eden, right? By one man's disobedience lost, we're back to the opening lines of Paradise Lost. Now sing, we're back to the key word of music again. Recovered paradise to all mankind by one man's firm obedience, fully tried through all temptation, and the tempter foiled in all his wiles, defeated and repulsed, and Eden raised in the waste wilderness. Now, there's some interesting observations we want to make here. Notice, right at the beginning, we're going to be told that this is going to be a poem about one man's, of course, man in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, incarnate man in the flesh, is the first book of John will tell us in those first 14 opening lines of that gospel. It is about obedience, and we want to put this in our notes because it's going to want to be one of the major themes of Paradise Regained, this notion of obedience. Of course, it was a central idea as well in Paradise Lost, wasn't it, right? This idea of trial, temptation, trial. We're going to come through all temptation, right? Okay. And the tempter, another word for Satan, foiled, that is to say, defeated. Eden, paradise, regained or raised here in the waste wilderness. Think about those final lines from Paradise Lost, Book 12, line 587. The literal and the figurative paradise within. So Milton is doing all kinds of things here in terms of bringing together the opening ideas of Paradise Regained. Thou, Spirit, to continue, who leads this glorious ermine into the desert, the morning star, will see it later, of course, Jesus Christ. His victorious field against the spiritual foe, let's go ahead and say it. Milton wants to write about warfare, but a spiritual, not a physical warfare, right? And broughtst him hence by proof, again, to justify the ways of God to men, the undoubted Son of God. Inspire as thou want my prompted song, we're back again to the notion of singing, else mute, and bear through height or depth of nature's bounds with prosperous wing, full summed to tell of deeds above heroic, though in secret done, and unrecorded left through many an age, worthy to have not remained so long unsung. Three references again to singing and to muses of singing. Of course, as we've said in earlier lectures on Paradise Lost, Milton's father was an amateur musician of some importance. Milton, of course, now here making sure we understand. He's going to tell a story that will be a song. A song of what? Obedience, no question. Warfare of a spiritual kind. But then let's finish by making a couple of quick points. I have already mentioned in the earlier intro lecture that prosperous wing here matters. I think that in the same way that Milton wrote Paradise Lost to respond to Shakespeare's, especially Hamlet, I'm going to argue that here we're going to have Milton responding to Shakespeare's Tempest. And of course, the final play of Shakespeare, we believe, in 1610, 1611, to be published. I think Prospero is the great voice of Shakespeare at the end of his life in Tempest. And I think Milton is acutely aware of this. In fact, at the very end of Book 1, we're going to see that Milton makes allusion to the play Tempest at the very end. I think that we are meant to keep Tempest in our minds as the great last work of Shakespeare. And of course, I think Milton knows this is the great, possibly last work of his life as well. This full-summed idea has to do with full wings, a hawk, full wings, in other words, fully grown. And this meaning, of course, that his feathers are matured. I think Milton himself is trying to tell us that while Paradise Lost was a great poem, Paradise Regained will be his mature poem. You're going to see less of the more of Paradise Lost, and you're going to see more of the heart of what for Milton is most significant. We could probably say his theology will be more clearly discussed and developed in Paradise Regained, which may account for why so many people have found this a lesser poem, simply because they wanted a poem that would be less about theology and more literary in its style and nature. So we'll begin. Now had the great proclaimer, with a voice more awful than the sound of trumpet, cried repentance and heaven's kingdom nigh at hand to all baptized. We're talking, of course, about John the Baptist, who is going to go out into the wilderness, where he will then begin to baptize in preparation, of course, for the Son of God. Now there's going to be the meeting of Satan right away at line 32. We're told the adversary roving still about the world, at that assembly famed would not at last, and with the voice divine, nigh thunderstruck the exalted man, to whom such high attest was given, a while surveyed with wonder. We're told that Satan is going to be concerned, because he's going to realize that when Jesus Christ comes out into the wilderness to be baptized by John, a story that's going to get mentioned at least 3 to 4 times in Book 1. And during that event, there will be a voice from heaven that will declare that Jesus is the Son with whom he is most pleased. Satan is going to hear this, and then he's going to make some observations. We should point out that already at line 32 and following, we'll begin to see that Satan is concerned about the voice of God. Now we know about the voice of God, don't we, from our study of Paradise Lost and the ways in which the voice of God can be a frightening voice. Of course, when the voice of God speaks, Satan himself will have to be, ultimately discharged from heaven and all of that. Lines 43 through 105 is Satan's speech. It's very much in the same tradition of Paradise Lost, where he says what to his co-conspirators, the demons of hell? Well, fundamentally, he says, look, the Genesis 3:15 passage that I made fun of earlier, now I'm a little concerned about, because it might be that God has made his play, and it's time for a serious consideration of what it means if the Son of God has come incarnate into the world. You can kind of see the project for Satan will be, I have to ruin God's plan a second time. The first time, of course, was when he snuck into Eden and defeated Eve first and then Adam, and that story is our story of Paradise Lost. We'll end at line 105 with the idea that ultimately what he's going to do is Satan is going to ruin again Adam at the very end of line 103, 104, 105, and he's going to deceive then Jesus Christ to prove to God once and for all that this project of his work. At line 109, then, we are told that these sad tidings, with deep dismay, the demons are then ready to make their decision. Their great dictator at line 113 will be with them, and then we'll have at line 122, this man of men, Satan, goes in search of Christ. Often this word man in the 1680 version of Paradise Regained was in fact capitalized to talk about the man, that is to say, of all men, Jesus Christ himself, of course. At line 130, and this follows very much like what happens in Paradise Lost, we have God who speaks to Gabriel and will make the point at line 143, let him tempt. Unafraid, unworried, let him tempt. And now say, that is to say again, the test, his utmost subtlety, because he boasts and vaunts of his great cunning to the throng of his apostasy. Now, of course, the question has to come to mind, what has Satan been doing since he last turned into a serpent in hell with all the other demons, and they ate from that tree of the fruit there in hell, the ash tree as we will refer to it, because the fruit turns to ash in their mouth. Well, of course, Satan has been wandering the earth, roaming. We'll get to that very word at the last word of Book 1 of Paradise Regained. And the idea here is simple. God says, I know that he tried it with Eve and Adam, and it worked to the degree that I allowed it to work, God says. But it's not going to work here, and this will be the paradise regaining that Milton is in reference to. Just to continue, God's speaking after line 143, let him tempt, God must allow the test to happen. At line 147, we have this notion about how Satan failed with Job. Now it's significant. Let's pause for a moment and remind ourselves why Job, the book of Job, and the character of Job, and the theodicy of the book of Job, so critical in this Paradise Regained. We mentioned this in Paradise Lost, that there is this topic that we call theodicy. The question of why is it possible or capable that a being that is all good, all knowing, all powerful could create a world where there is sin and suffering. That is to say, the theodicy question. And Milton will qualify it as to try to justify the ways of God to men. Yes? Now, of course, the classic text of theodicy in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Job, that great man of God who loses his family and all of his stuff and then his health. His wife will tell him to curse God and die, and he says, no, no. We often will juxtapose this story out of the school of Jerusalem with the story out of the school of Athens, the story of Prometheus, who is a different kind of character altogether. Here, Milton will point out that in the end, Satan didn't get Job, and he's not going to get the Son of God either. And then beginning at line 50, God speaking says, he, Satan, now shall know I can produce a man, a female seed, far abler to resist all his solicitations, and at length all his vast force, and drive him back to hell, winning by conquest what the first man lost by fallacy surprised. In other words, this is going to be part 2 of the story. But first, I mean to exercise him here being the Son of God, Christ, in the wilderness. The importance of the wilderness versus the importance of Eden. Now, a lot of scholars and theologians have pointed this out, that it's very possible that when you're sitting in Eden and you have everything right there for you, you don't have to go through the intellectual and spiritual dark night of the soul, to speak in Christian mystic language, that Christ is going to have to go through. And the Son of God says, I will exercise him. There he in the wilderness shall first lay down the rudiments of his great warfare, ere I send him forth to conquer sin and death, the two grand foes. Now, of course, sin and death are characters that we met in Paradise Lost Book 2 in that disgusting allegorical scene. I'll let you go back and remind yourself through those lectures in your own study of that one. By humiliation and strong sufferance, his weakness shall overcome satanic strength. Line 161. These reversals, or these antonyms, are all as important in our reading of Paradise Regained. It is going to be the weakness, that's perceived weakness of the Son of God, that ultimately will overcome satanic strength. One way to read this, and I think that Milton is very much gesturing this way from our study of Areopagitica, is we're going to get into a dialectic or a debate, and it's ultimately going to hinge on our understanding of hermeneutics, interpretation, and in the end, the Son of God's going to have a stronger interpretation than satanic strength. In all the world, and mass of sinful flesh, that all the angels and ethereal powers, they now and men hereafter may discern, from what consummate virtue I have chose this perfect man, by merit called my son, to earn salvation for the sons of men. Now, of course, this is just patently Christian theology. To justify the loss of Eden, the Son of God must come. He must become incarnate. He must die on a cross. He then must be resurrected for there to be hope of all men, to be able to not have to suffer the idea of sin and death. Fundamental Christian theology. And here we have at line 67 then the project. And we might think of it as that. It is the project. It is the test. In some ways, Milton seems to be suggesting that Jesus Christ, as a lad, will grow up. We're going to hear a little about that in a bit. And then he's going to have to go out into the wilderness after his baptism. And it will be there that Christ will then discover his mission. It will be at that point, in a moment of challenge, we might say, right? When everything is really a tough struggle. We think immediately, don't we, of, for example, what happens in our classical Arthurian motif after he draws this sword Excalibur from the stone? Well, he's got to go through that dark night of the soul. That idea that the knights had, the idea that the monks had as well. This is a very ancient idea, and Milton's going to be drawing on it. After God finishes at line 168, we have the hymns of heaven. We're back to some of the singing of the angels in heaven. And then starting at line 172 or so, we're going to begin with the argument, right? Victory and triumph we'll have at 172 and following will be the singing of the great duel, victory and triumph to the Son of God, now entering this great duel not of arms, but to vanquish by wisdom hellish wiles. So this notion of wisdom versus knowledge, let's put it in our notes. It's going to be one that we'll come back to several times in Paradise Regained. The idea that Jesus Christ is going to have wisdom. The devil, Satan, will have knowledge. He'll quote biblical text, for example. And in the story from both Matthew 1 or Matthew 4 and Luke 4 of the Gospels that tell this story in the New Testament, Christ will in fact quote all from the book of Deuteronomy. And yet there's wisdom in Christ's words, only knowledge in Satan's words. And so we'll come to this idea. In line 196, we finally meet our first kind of roughly 182. So they in heaven, their odes and vigils tuned. Meanwhile, the Son of God, who yet some days lodged in Betherba, where John baptized, musing and much revolving in his breast how best the mighty work he might begin of Savior to mankind, in which way first publish his godlike office, now mature, one day forth walked alone. So our first view of Christ is alone, walking in the wilderness, alone. The Spirit leading, and that's important, especially in the